Yay, it's 2019. This is the beginning of a new year. My kids are back at school. I imagine your kids are too if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, you are still wrangling children on school holidays. So the question for this week is, at what age should we start talking about sexuality with our children? Great question. So we're going to do this within 6 minutes because this is 6-minute sex ed sitting in a car for parents. The word sexuality is a broad word. So we're not just talking about intercourse here. We're talking about what human sexuality is, what being a sexual human being is like. So a question like this comes from the old understanding that parents had that talking about sex to their kids would happen in one talk. That you would go about your everyday life talking about food, talking about sport, talking about being kind to each other, talking about personal hygiene, talking about how to listen, how to do the dishes, blah, blah, blah. And then at one point in a kid's life, you would sit them down and you would have the talk. And you would talk about intercourse and how babies are made. So instead of talking about sex in one talk, the accepted practice and the best thing to do for ourselves as parents and for our kids is to have an ongoing conversation about things related to sexuality. So not just sex as intercourse, but sexuality. Things like people are attracted to different sorts of people. There are different sorts of relationships in the world. Our bodies are meant to feel nice. We are in charge of our own bodies. And if we don't like things, then they shouldn't be happening to us. All those topics and plenty more are related to the idea of sexuality. So when the question is, what age should we start talking about sexuality? The answer actually is from the very beginning. So I'm going to look down here at my notes because we can talk about sexuality to 0 to 4-year-olds. And that can go something like this. We can talk to them about the enjoyment and pleasure they might get from touching their own body. Okay, we can talk about the fact that enjoyment of physical closeness is part of being human, part of everybody's life, mostly everybody's life. So we could talk about that in terms of when we're giving our kids hugs and kisses, when they're giving us hugs and kisses, if they're hugging and kissing their siblings or their cousins. We could talk about things like how tenderness and being physically close is often an expression of how people display or show someone else their love and their affection. Now, I always use qualifying words like often and mostly because there are a lot of people in our world that don't show affection and closeness through physical touch. So, we're going to do the best we can as parents, and we are going to talk to our kids about these broad topics on the understanding that if you notice that your kid is not one of those kids that likes physical touch or seeks physical touch, then you might decide to temper that message a bit. So you could be talking about many people in the world, but not all people. And some of the people in our family don't do that, but a lot of people do. Yeah, so you're starting to teach them that they may experience one sort of thing about their body, but that doesn't mean that other people in the world experience the same thing. We are all different. And this message of we are all different is going to impact every single conversation you have with your kid about their body and other people's body and sexuality. And so that message is something you can start really early, 0 to 4. We can be talking to them from 0 to 4 about yes and no feelings, how sometimes we can sense in our body when we want to do something, when we want to touch someone or when we want them to touch us. And what other things, that there are different kinds of relationships, different kinds of family relationships. So you see, 0 to 4. Now you wouldn't think this, and I would just like to say to most of you who are listening to this or watching this that 0 to 4 is a very young age, and your kids are now probably actually older than that. And that's okay, because as parents, we're not taught that we can start talking about sexuality when our kids are 0 to 4. You know, we're not taught that. And apart from which, when our kids are 0 to 4, which when my kids were, I was deeply wrangling things like potty training and stair safety and making sure they used their seatbelt in their car, and how we were managing taking them to childcare, or how we were managing how much screen they were watching when they were home. It is incredibly complicated parenting, isn't it? There are so many things we have to be juggling. And so when you're listening to this, if your kids are older than 0 to 4, that's okay. You can start talking about those concepts to them now too. So keep in mind that when we're talking about sexuality with our kids, it's not intercourse. There are all these different other things we can be talking about to them, which will help them have a broad understanding of what sexuality is like as part of being human. It's not just about intercourse. There are heaps of other things to understand and to learn. I hope that's helpful. That was your 6-minute sex ed sitting in a car for this week. I will see you again for another 6 minutes. Bye.